As I stood amidst the smoking ruins of the world we had set ablaze, I could feel the weight of my own choices, pressing upon me like a suffocating shroud, for the Third Reich had crumbled into dust beneath the boots of the Allied victors. And now, like so many of my comrades, I found myself trapped in the dreadful interstice between judgment and escape, hunted like vermin through the skeletons of cities we had once called ours. The year was 1945, but for us, the architects, the enforcers, the unrepentant loyalists of a fallen regime, the war was far from over. It had merely transformed into a desperate race for survival, a desperate scramble to outrun the retribution that loomed like the shadow of a gallows. I was not alone in this nightmare fugue of flight. Names that would one day be whispered with horror. Eichmann, Mengele, Barbie. They too had vanished into the labyrinth of secrecy and deception, weaving through the narrow alleys and hidden corridors of Europe like phantoms of guilt and complicity. The rat lines, they called it, a clandestine network of salvation stitched together. By shadowy hands, a series of passageways leading us away from the noose that awaited stretching, like sinuous veins toward distant forgiving lands. Argentina, Syria, Egypt, places that promised us sanctuary from the reckoning we had earned. And behind these lifelines were those who, for reasons tangled in faith politics or shared enmity for the red specter of communism, offered their aid. Priests in sanctuaries whispered coded prayers. Monks in ancient abbeys pressed forged documents into our trembling hands. And agents of organizations, some as revered as the Vatican itself, others as vast as the Red Cross, turned blind eyes or lent clandestine support, transforming our cursed flight into a cruel parody of mercy. We who had once mastered the machinery of oppression now became its desperate supplicants, leaning on the very structures we had scorned to shelter us from justice. In this twilight of our crimes, however, a relentless shadow stalked us, still a man, who had walked through the gates of hell and emerged not with vengeance, but with an unbreakable resolve to see us brought to account. His name was Simon Wiesenthal, and though the world knew him only as a survivor, we feared him as our executioner in patience. From his modest post-war office, he gathered fragments, rumors, sightings, whispers on the wind, and with the obsessive devotion of a man who had lost everything, he wove those threads into nets designed to catch us one by one. I remember the terror we whispered among ourselves when news arrived that one of us had been taken. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution itself, seized in 1960 from his sanctuary in Argentina by Israeli agents who had traced his shadow through years of Wiesenthal's tireless hunting. His capture rippled through our ranks like a warning bell, a grim reminder that though time moved forward, the past did not sleep. Each of us wondered, would we be next? Would we too be pulled from our new lives and forced to answer for the unspeakable acts etched in the ledger of history? Yet even as the hunt continued, so many among us slipped through the cracks of memory, our names dissolving into the murky fog of forgotten sins. And as Anne Frank had once written in her secret refuge words that haunted even my hollow soul, what is done cannot be undone, but one can prevent it happening again. Whether those words brought comfort to the victims or condemnation to us who had evaded the scales of justice, I could not say, but I carried them like an invisible chain that no escape route could sever. And so, as the years stretched onward, the question hung heavy in the air: how many of us had truly escaped? How many had vanished so completely that even history itself might fail to find us? The world I knew was ready to peer into those dark corridors once more, to untangle the knots of complicity and cowardice that had allowed us to flee into the night. But for me and those like me, we lived beneath the ceaseless dread that the shadows we thought our refuge might one day betray us to the light. I still remember the day they led me into that grand chamber of cold marble and high ceilings, the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, where history itself would soon hold us beneath its pitiless gaze. The war had ended but for me, and for the others seated in that ominous dock. The true battle had only just begun, a battle not of weapons, but of judgment, of evidence, of accusations, spoken aloud before the entire watching world. We had ruled with iron and blood. Now we sat as prisoners while our deeds were laid bare under the relentless scrutiny of nations who gathered not for vengeance but for reckoning. The world called it the Nuremberg trials, though for us it was more like standing before an altar of condemnation, where every name read aloud was another nail in the coffin of our defense. There were 24 of us at the center of it all, generals, ministers, party loyalists, men whose hands were steeped in the unspeakable acts we once believed righteous. Keitel sat among us stoic and expressionless, Jodl cold and calculating, Kaltenbrunner his sharp features betraying no remorse. And of course there was Göring, arrogant, defiant, still clinging to the poisoned pride of his shattered Reich. We were accused of crimes that pierced through the fabric of civilization itself. Crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and something unfamiliar, yet dreadful, conspiracy, that unseen web of planning and complicity that had ensnared us all long before the first shots were fired. The absence of Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels dead by their own hands only cast longer shadows across our ranks, for their ghosts loomed heavily in that courtroom, reminders of who had summoned us to serve their vision of horror. As the proceedings began, the machinery of justice unfurled with a precision we once wielded in war, but which now was turned against us. The voices of prosecutors echoed in multiple tongues, English, French, Russian, German, translated seamlessly through earphones that fed the multilingual hunger of the tribunal. I watched the interpreters in their glass booths, their faces pale beneath the weight of words. They were forced to repeat words of agony, torture, massacre, and calculated extermination. Evidence was laid before us like a mountain of bones. Films flickered to life on screens, grotesque images of skeletal prisoners stumbling through the ruins of concentration camps we once called necessary instruments of order. The faces of survivors testified to our cruelty in voices that trembled but did not break. Documents signed by our own hands were read aloud, each one a damning confession in ink and paper. Witnesses spoke of gas chambers, of mass graves, of the screams of children separated from their mothers on cold railway platforms under the hollow glare of floodlights. And then came the words that would carve themselves into the marrow of history, spoken by Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored. His voice was steady, unyielding, as though he carried upon his shoulders the collective weight of every murdered soul. Among the most chilling moments was the introduction of the term that would haunt generations to come: genocide. The systematic extermination of Jews, Romani, the disabled political dissidents, the full breadth of our orchestrated slaughter was laid bare beneath that terrible word, and no amount of defiance from Göring or rationalization from others could blot out the truth we had birthed. But the tribunal was not merely a theater of condemnation. There were acquittals, Fritzsche von Papen reminders that this was not simple retribution, but a deliberate exercise in law, a measured attempt to prove that even after such evil civilization could rise and judge without surrendering to the same brutality it sought to punish. And so it was that this trial birthed not only verdicts, but principles, the Nuremberg Code, which would forever alter the ethics of medicine, drawn from the ghastly experiments our doctors performed on the helpless. As I sat there hour after hour, I could feel the eyes of the world upon me, not as the soldier I once was, nor as the servant of a leader I once adored, but as a relic of shame, a symbol of humanity's capacity to lose its soul beneath the banners of ideology. The words of Justice Jackson echoed in my thoughts long after the verdicts were rendered. The record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. We who had once believed we were the architects of a new world now found ourselves as monuments of infamy, judged not only by our enemies, but by the centuries to come. And in that courtroom beneath the unmoving gaze of history, I saw the terrible truth that though we might speak in our defense, the ghosts of the dead had spoken louder still. When the iron gates of the Reich finally shattered, and the banners we once worshipped lay trampled beneath the boots of the victors, I, like many of my comrades, was gripped by a single consuming instinct to flee. The war had been lost, our Führer was dead, and the world that once trembled before us now demanded retribution. But there were still paths hidden, winding, treacherous, that offered salvation to men like me. They called them the rat lines, and we whispered the name of Odessa in hushed reverence as though invoking a secret god who might deliver us from justice. Odessa Organisation, der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen. Whether myth or shadowed truth was our lifeline. It was whispered that former SS men, those who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with me in unwavering loyalty, had built it from the ashes of our collapse. Its purpose was simple and desperate: to create sanctuaries where none should exist, to carry us beyond the reach of tribunals and prison cells into lands where we might reinvent ourselves beneath false names and stolen lives. By 1946, these networks had already begun to pulse with activity spreading like veins through the fractured corpse of Europe. The rat lines wove their way southward from Austria to Italy, then across the vast ocean to the warm embrace of South America, to Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Each step required trust, secrecy, and the aid of those who, for reasons of faith, ideology, or mutual convenience, chose to assist us. I can still see the faces of those who helped us slip away, sympathetic priests cloaked in robes of mercy, former fascists, who saw in us comrades of a shared vision, and government officials whose signatures transformed forgeries into passports. Bishop Alois Hudal, stationed in Rome, was one of the most whispered names among us. His quiet influence and willing hand opened many doors that should have remained shut. Through these passages, many of us vanished like smoke. Eichmann, the man who had overseen the annihilation of millions, found his refuge in Argentina, living as Ricardo Clement. It was a name that masked his past, but not his guilt. Years would pass before the relentless hunt caught up to him. Then there was Josef Mengele der Todesengel, the angel of death, who slipped through the cracks and found sanctuary in Brazil. Under the alias Wolfgang Gerhard, he lived undisturbed until death finally claimed him long before justice could. Forged documents, secret funds, and silent sympathizers made our exodus possible. We traveled by night, concealed by false identities, often hidden among throngs of genuine refugees, men, women, and children, whose only crime had been to survive the devastation we had unleashed. In their desperate masses, we concealed our darker burdens. The Vatican itself became a whispered center of controversy. Some said its holy corridors offered sanctuary. Others said it turned its gaze away in willful ignorance. Men like Hudal acted as conduits, but how deep the institution's involvement reached remained shrouded in rumors and sealed archives. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of post-war displacement, became another unintended accomplice, issuing travel documents to those of us who exploited the confusion and disorder. With every forged identity card or falsified certificate, we slipped further away from the gallows. Argentina, under Juan Perón, became our promised land. He welcomed us not as criminals, but as exiles valuing our loyalty to anti-communism and our potential to aid his regime. His pragmatism offered us not only safety, but opportunity, a chance to build new lives upon the wreckage of the old. Brazil, Paraguay, and Chile followed similar paths, opening doors behind which we could hide. And as the Cold War cast its long shadow across the world, our fates became entangled in the great chessboard of East and West. Both sides, hungry for intelligence and expertise, were willing to turn blind eyes to our pasts if we might serve their present aims. Some of my former comrades offered their skills in science espionage or propaganda bargaining their dark legacies for survival beneath new masters. In time, our story became not only history, but legend whispered in books, reenacted in films, spun into conspiracy and fascination. The Odessa File, they called it, a tale born from truth and speculation alike, reflecting the enduring horror and seduction of our flight from justice. But for those of us who lived it, the Odessa network was no fiction. It was salvation wrapped in shadows. Each border crossed, each false name adopted, each silent ally encountered was another stolen breath bought from the hangman's noose. And yet, even as we disappeared into these carefully constructed lives, the weight of our deeds clung to us like a second skin. No forged passport could wash away the blood on our hands. As the fires of war finally dimmed and the smoldering ruins of Europe cooled beneath a broken sky, I found myself facing a peculiar and unexpected salvation, not from the secret rat lines that carried so many of my comrades into hiding, but from the very victors who had once sworn to destroy us. They called it Operation Paperclip, though for me, and for others like me, it was nothing less than a strange and bitter miracle, a lifeline spun not from mercy, but from ambition. The Americans came not with shackles, but with offers, not with tribunals, but with contracts. They sought our minds, our knowledge, the twisted fruits of years spent serving the most brutal regime history had ever known. In those final days, we were not judged as war criminals, but appraised as commodities. Our crimes weighed against our usefulness in the new war, already stirring upon the horizon, the Cold War. I still remember the day my name was clipped onto one of their files, literally, with a simple paper clip, as if that small, mundane piece of wire could erase the years I had spent beneath the banners of the Reich. My affiliations, my past allegiances, my complicity in the horrors committed, all temporarily sanitized, folded into a new identity curated to serve a purpose far greater than my past sins. In this quiet compromise, my former enemies made a choice. They would trade the purity of justice for the expedience of survival. Over 1/600 of us crossed into America's embrace under the cover of secrecy. Engineers, physicists, chemists, doctors, men whose hands had once built the engines of war, now set to design the machines of the future. I was no longer simply a man of the Reich. I had become a resource of the United States government. At the heart of this transaction stood men like Werner von Braun, our brilliant visionary, once the architect of the V2 rocket that rained terror upon London. I had worked alongside him at Peenemünde, where we built the world's first long-range ballistic missiles, powered by the suffering of those forced to labor beneath our feet. And yet now the same mind once turned to destruction was repurposed to carry mankind into the heavens. We were first stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, so far from the crumbled walls of Berlin, yet never far enough to escape the echoes of what we had done. Here we labored beneath the stars we once only dreamed of conquering, developing the Redstone rockets that would soon carry nuclear payloads and eventually American astronauts into space. Each launch was a strange form of penance, as though each ascent into the sky might somehow sift us away from the shadows of our past. But the stain upon us was not so easily shed. I often heard whispers about Hubertus Strughold, the so-called father of space medicine, whose experiments on human beings, frozen, starved, suffocated in cruel tests, had granted him knowledge the Americans now coveted. He too was welcomed into their fold, his past scrubbed clean enough for public comfort, though never enough for true absolution. Not all Americans were willing to accept this unholy bargain. Men like Senator J. William Fulbright raised their voices, condemning our quiet importation into the heart of their democracy. They argued that the price of our knowledge was far too high, that no scientific advancement could justify the pollution of justice. But in the great calculus of the Cold War, their protests were brushed aside. The Soviets were advancing. The Americans needed us, and so we labored our work, culminating in marvels that seemed to erase our origins. The Saturn V, which carried men to the moon. Explorer 1, America's first satellite. Our fingerprints marked the stars themselves. Von Braun rose to prominence, his face beaming on television screens, his name praised in schools and newsreels. And yet, beneath the applause, we carried the silent knowledge of who we had once been and what we had done to reach this place. Operation Paperclip was not a rescue. It was a transaction. The Americans had not saved us, they had purchased us. And we had not escaped judgment, we had merely delayed it, hiding beneath rockets and research, while the weight of our pasts pulsed just beneath the surface. As historian Clarence Lasby once described it, this strange union between victor and vanquished was a marriage of convenience, a grim alliance in which both sides sought advantage while pretending not to see the ghosts standing among us. And though we built monuments of science that reached beyond the earth itself, no height on what we attained could lift the heavy burden of what we carried within. When the war was finally lost and the world's fury turned its eyes upon us, I understood that it was no longer merely my own skin I needed to preserve. It was the very essence of the Reich that stood on trial. They called it denazification, this vast and intricate effort to strip the Nazi stain from every corner of Germany, to cleanse a people and a land saturated with our banners, our words, our deeds. And though I walked its edges as both witness and target, I saw its machinery unfold with an almost impossible ambition. The Allies, the Americans, the British, the French, the Soviets, divided what was left of our once proud nation, carving us into zones of control. Each sought to root out the venom we had so carefully cultivated, but their hand differed in firmness and method. In the American zone, where I first felt their grasp, denazification was a colossal and exhausting enterprise. They forced millions of my countrymen, and me among them, to complete the Fragebogen, endless pages of questions demanding we expose our affiliations, our actions, our loyalty. It was an attempt to draw neat lines between guilt and innocence, between willing servants and reluctant followers. But even as I filled those forms, scribbling carefully chosen words into each box, I knew how porous such paper barriers could be. How many of us simply lied? How many minimized, concealed, or deflected? The Americans processed 13 million of us, but how could they see into hearts grown expert in self-preservation? Bureaucracy, in its clumsy way, became both weapon and shield, sifting some but missing many. The British were gentler, more focused on restoring civic life than punishing every thread of complicity. The French wavered, their denazification often fragmented, lost beneath the weight of their own reconstruction. The Soviets, by contrast, wielded their purges like a scythe, not merely eliminating Nazis, but carving away any who might oppose their growing communist dominion. In their zone, guilt was often presumed punishment swift. As months passed into years, the great spectacle of denazification played out. The Nuremberg trials, which I had watched with dread, stood as the most visible summit of this process, the grand stage where the most notorious among us were judged before the world. But beyond those few high-profile trials lay the real and sprawling work schools emptied of teachers who once praised Hitler in their classrooms, libraries stripped of our propaganda, statues torn from their pedestals, swastikas chipped from stone and steel. In theaters and cinemas, the Allies broadcast films designed to reprogram us, the Hitler Gang, our job in Germany, each frame a lesson, a sermon of guilt and democratic salvation. Even our children's textbooks were rewritten beneath foreign hands, replacing our doctrine with theirs. The very air of our cities seemed scrubbed of the banners and chants that once defined them. And yet, I saw too how swiftly the tide began to turn. As the Cold War thickened its iron curtain across Europe, the Americans and British grew less concerned with our past sins and more eager to rebuild a Germany that might stand against Soviet expansion. Where once there had been lists of names to expel and prosecute, there were now offices eager for men with experience, expertise, and loyalty to the emerging West. Thousands of us returned quietly to our professions. Judges who had signed death warrants resumed their benches. Professors who had taught Aryan supremacy reopened their lectures. Businessmen who had fueled the war machine built new fortunes. I watched many of my former comrades slip effortlessly back into the machinery of the state, their pasts conveniently blurred by the urgency of geopolitical necessity. In truth, denazification was never just about law or morality. It was also theater, a display for the world to see, while beneath its stage, countless accommodations were made. Some of us evaded entirely, others were momentarily displaced and then restored. The deeper roots of our ideology, the hatred, the hierarchies, the belief in racial destiny were not so easily plucked from soil so thoroughly seeded. The Americans, for all their might, soon tired of the exhaustive task. The Soviets twisted the process to their advantage. The French and British lost momentum. And thus, even as the world declared that Germany was reborn as a democracy, the shadows of the Reich lingered beneath the fresh paint. To purge us completely would have required not only trials and questionnaires, but the unraveling of an entire society willing to march beside us for 12 terrible years. And so while the world proclaimed our cleansing, I knew, as did many, that beneath the new order, the remnants of the old still pulsed like embers beneath ash. In the smoldering wreckage of the Reich's collapse, as the war's final echoes faded into uneasy silence, we, the hunted remnants of a fallen empire, found ourselves searching for cracks in the victorious world. Small, merciful shadows where the relentless fingers of justice might not reach. And within those shadows, I had discovered unlikely sanctuaries, places wrapped not in military might or political intrigue, but in the flowing robes of priests and the quiet stamps of humanitarian clerks. Even as the Allies hunted our names, some among the world's most revered institutions offered doors that swung open to men like me. The Vatican, that ancient walled city in the heart of Rome, stood like a silent witness as many of us passed through its orbit. Officially, it claimed neutrality, a posture of quiet diplomacy amid the storms of nations. But within certain corridors, behind certain closed doors, I encountered sympathetic hands willing to guide my escape. I was not alone. Others whispered of men like Franz Stangl, once the master of death at Treblinka, who found in the church's network the means to vanish, slipping across borders toward distant lands where justice would struggle to follow. There were names we all spoke in grateful reverence, Bishop Alois Hudal, chief among them, whose clerical robes concealed not only his priestly vows, but his understanding of our plight. Hudal, we said, was one of ours in spirit, if not in uniform. He offered prayers, yes, but more importantly, he offered documents. With forged papers and quiet instructions, he became a shepherd to men like me, leading us not toward salvation of the soul, but toward refuge from earthly retribution. His sympathies were no secret among us. His motives, perhaps a blend of anti-communism, twisted mercy, and ideological kinship. But the Vatican was not the only gate through which we fled. The Red Cross, that noble guardian of the world's wounded and displaced, became, whether knowingly or blindly, another unlikely ally. In the chaos of Europe's millions of refugees, the Red Cross issued countless travel documents and identity papers struggling under the weight of humanitarian catastrophe. And into that vast flood of desperation, we slipped like wolves among scattered sheep. I too held in my hand one of those precious passports, marked not with my true name, but with a carefully chosen fiction. My new identity, crafted upon ink and hope, carried me far from the crumbling ruins of Germany. Men like Eichmann, who fled to Argentina as Ricardo Clement, owed their freedom to similar tricks of paper and confusion. The systems designed to heal the wounded had inadvertently carried many of us beyond the reach of our accusers. Some whispered bitterly that the Church and the Red Cross had betrayed their sacred duties. Others argued they had merely done what mercy required amidst the ruin of millions. For me, their roles were neither betrayal nor mercy. They were survival. They were the thin, fragile threads that allowed us to pass through the ruins of Europe into new lives built atop the silence of unanswered crimes. In the years that followed, debates would rage in distant halls. Historians would pore over sealed archives. Politicians would issue statements of defense or regret. But I, like many who passed through those quiet doors, knew well that the truth was not so easily dissected. The Vatican navigated a world of political currents it could not control. The Red Cross faced an ocean of human need it could not contain. And we simply exploited what was offered. Whether through faith, fear, or fatigue, their hands opened gates that justice would have kept closed. And as I crossed those borders under false names beneath stolen identities, I did not ask whether they were complicit. I only whispered silent thanks that they had looked away long enough for me to slip beyond the reach of the hangman. Even as I vanished into the folds of my new identity, even as I built walls of false names and distant borders around myself, there was always one man whose presence haunted my every step. A man whose very existence seemed crafted from the ashes of all we had done. His name was Simon Wiesenthal, and though I never saw his face, I felt his breath at my back like a cold wind that refused to cease. He was not a judge, nor a soldier, nor a politician. He was in truth something far more dangerous to men like me. He was a survivor. From the depths of our darkest invention, the camps of Janowska Plasov Mauthausen, he had emerged carrying not just his own battered body, but the burning memory of the countless souls we had crushed beneath our boots. 89 of his family gone, swallowed into the abyss of the final solution we had orchestrated. And from that unspeakable loss, he had fashioned his life's purpose to find us, to drag us from whatever holes we had burrowed into, to ensure the world would never forget what we had done. While we scattered like rats across continents, Wiesenthal stayed his desk, a cluttered monument to tenacity, his files thick with the fragments of our lies and mistakes. Where most would have chosen to bury the past, beneath grief he exhumed it, piece by piece. His network of informants, his mastery of whispers and rumors, all of it became the web into which so many of my comrades eventually stumbled. I remember when word reached me, a chill that raced through those of us still hiding. Adolf Eichmann, our engineer of annihilation, had been captured. In Argentina, no less, plucked from his sanctuary by the long arm of Israeli Mossad agents. But it was Wiesenthal who had first lit the trail, who had gathered the scattered rumors and fed the fire that eventually consumed Eichmann's sanctuary. His trial in Jerusalem was not simply a courtroom drama. It was a resurrection of our victims' voices echoing before the world. His execution was a reminder that justice, though slow, still hunted us. And then there was Franz Steingl, once the master of Treblinka and Sobibor, where nearly 900,000 souls perished beneath his command. His flight had carried him to Brazil, but not far enough. Again, it was Wiesenthal's relentless pursuit, his tireless collection of shadows, that finally led to Stengel's capture. His fall was another crack in the fragile shells many of us had built. I often wondered how one man operating from a small, crowded office in Vienna could wield such terrifying power. But it was not power he held, it was purpose. He did not seek vengeance. His obsession was something colder, heavier. As he himself once said, justice, not vengeance. And it was that purity which made him so formidable. Even as some accused him, whispering that he exaggerated, that his numbers were inflated, that his methods strained legality, Wiesenthal remained unbowed. He did not chase approval. He chased only us. His Simon Wiesenthal Center would rise in Los Angeles, its name becoming synonymous with the eternal hunt for truth amidst the ruins we had left behind. By the time death finally claimed him in 2005, almost 100 of my former comrades had felt the weight of his pursuit. Some were dragged into courtrooms. Others were exposed and shamed before the world. And yet for each name crossed off his lists, 1,000 more lurked unseen men like me, who still breathed freely but never peacefully. It was not only the famous arrests that defined his legacy. It was the weight of knowing that no matter how far we ran, no matter how deeply we buried our identities, Wiesenthal would never sleep while we remained unaccounted for. He was a living embodiment of every oath made by the world at Nuremberg, that such evil would not be permitted to fade into silence. For men like me, Wiesenthal was not a man. He was a shadow, tireless patient, inevitable. Even as some of us were hunted down and dragged into courts, even as the world held its great trials and declared its verdicts with righteous fury, I watched with quiet astonishment how so many others men whose hands had been as blood-stained as my own slipped not into hiding, but into power once more. The world, it seemed, was far more forgiving, or perhaps far more pragmatic, than its declarations of justice ever admitted. I saw it unfold before my very eyes. In the years after the war's end, while denazification was still spoken of in public behind closed doors, another reality took shape. Germany, now broken, divided, and at the crossroads of the Cold War, no longer served only as a symbol of guilt. It had become a pawn, a shield against the growing threat of communism. And suddenly men like us were not simply the condemned. We were experienced administrators, seasoned officials, irreplaceable technicians, valuable once more to those who needed to rebuild a strong West Germany. By 1957, nearly 77% of senior officials in the Justice Ministry were former members of our party. 77%. Even I, steeped in my own guilt, could barely comprehend the number. Those who had once sworn oaths beneath the banners of the Reich now drafted new laws beneath the flags of the Federal Republic. I remember Hans Globke, a man who had helped draft the very Nuremberg laws that enshrined our racial purity doctrines, stripping citizenship from millions. And yet there he stood, elevated to Chief of Staff under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. His pen once criminalized entire races. Now it signed policy for a democratic Germany. I heard Adenauer defend him with a chilling simplicity. "I'll take my Globke over your general any day." Such was the currency of experience in this fragile new world. And then there was Kurt Georg Kiesinger, once a loyal party member within the Foreign Ministry, during our reign, now Chancellor of West Germany itself by 1966. I watched him rise while the youth of the nation, those who had not yet forgotten the ghosts we created, protested in the streets. One brave woman, Beate Klarsfeld, even slapped him in public, calling him a Nazi to his face. But still he ruled. Even beyond the realm of politics, I saw how men like Werner von Braun, my old colleague, who had once built rockets to rain death upon London, became heroes in America's space race. His past, like mine, was simply adjusted, sanitized for public consumption, framed as unfortunate necessity in the battle against the Soviets. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, though I dared not call it that aloud. In Austria, too, I saw reports that up to 60% of bureaucrats were former party members like myself. Files had been lost, records destroyed, and investigations often abandoned under the weight of overwhelming numbers. There were simply too many of us to prosecute. Entire systems would have collapsed if all who were guilty had been swept away. We who had once sworn absolute loyalty to the Führer now dressed ourselves as patriots of democracy or as experts in administration or as indispensable men of science. Our crimes blurred into forgotten paperwork, while the world, desperate for stability, allowed us to walk free under new titles. But even as I watched these transformations, I could not fully silence the disquiet inside me. Hannah Arendt's words echoed in the growing discourse the banality of evil. She spoke not of monstrous figures, but of ordinary men, men like me, who had done monstrous things because we were obedient, ambitious, and blind. We had not needed to be fanatics. We had only needed to do our jobs. That was the most terrible truth. Evil had worn our faces, not because we had been devils, but because we had been so painfully human. In this strange post-war world, I understood the cruel bargain being struck. The Allies, first so eager to purge us, now required our experience to defend their fragile order against Soviet expansion. Stability demanded compromise. Justice at times was too expensive. And so I remained one of many shadows, walking freely beneath the fragile peace, never certain whether we had escaped history or whether it had merely postponed its final judgment. Even as I tried to bury my past, beneath layers of new identities, forged documents, and distant borders, I knew that my true legacy could never be so easily hidden, not from the world, and certainly not from my own blood. For those of us who carried the heavy stain of the Reich, the poison did not die with us. It seeped forward into the lives of our children and grandchildren, staining their futures with the sins we could never fully outrun. I often imagined the burdens that weighed upon them, the children born not into our triumph, but into our disgrace. Some, like Gudrun, daughter of Heinrich Himmler himself, the man who orchestrated the machinery of extermination, never turned away from their father's shadows. She stood defiantly loyal, never renouncing him, never disowning the monstrous legacy she had inherited. I heard whispers of her work with Stille Hilfe, offering aid and comfort to others like me, to the condemned, the hunted, the disgraced. Even decades later, she clung to the belief that all had been done for Germany. And yet, not all bore the weight as she did. There were others like Edda Goering, daughter of Hermann Goering, my former superior, who walked a different path, silent and withdrawn, trapped between private love and public horror. She lived her life beneath the constant weight of judgment, rarely speaking his name, yet unable to sever herself completely from the man who had once stood second only to Hitler himself. In rare moments, she admitted that she had loved her father, though she struggled with the enormity of his crimes. What torment must that quiet love have been wrapped in guilt she had not earned yet, could never escape? Some tried to fight the legacy outright, to face it, dissect it, and denounce it with brutal honesty. I read with quiet unease of Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, once Governor General of occupied Poland, the butcher of millions. Nicholas publicly denounced his father, calling him not only a criminal, but a fanatic. He wrote openly of his revulsion, of his shame, of his determination, that his father's crimes should never be forgotten or softened. The father. A settling of accounts. Even the title of his book carried the bitter weight of inherited damnation. Others like Rainer Höss, grandson of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, chose to confront the abyss directly. He traveled to the very place where his grandfather had orchestrated industrialized murder. Standing upon those grounds, he declared his rejection of the blood that linked them. I decided not to be his grandson, he said, and I could not help but wonder if I would have had the same courage had our positions been reversed. Still, not every descendant faced their history with such defiance. Harold Quant's stepson to Joseph Goebbels slipped into immense wealth, avoiding public discourse, while his family's fortune flourished. His silence stood in stark contrast to the public soul-bearing of others. The Quants held powerful stakes in companies like BMW, and only much later did the world begin probing the tainted origins of their fortune stained by forced labor, exploitation, and war. And then there were those who went even further, choosing not only to reject their bloodline, but to sever its future entirely. I heard of Bettina Goering, great niece of Hermann Goering, who, driven by dread of her inherited darkness, made the irreversible decision to sterilize herself. I feared I might create another monster, she confessed. Those words echoed in my mind like a chilling confession of generational guilt, as though my crimes and those of my comrades had created shadows so long they could reach even into unborn generations. We had once imagined our Reich would last 1,000 years. Instead, it was our disgrace that endured past like a cursed inheritance to children who neither asked for nor deserved it. As I drifted further into my twilight years, I often wondered what weighed heavier upon these descendants, the judgment of the world, or the silent war within their own hearts. Could any of them truly escape what we had done? Could any of them ever be free? For even as I fled from courts and tribunals, I knew there was one punishment I had escaped, but they could not the bitter burden of being born from monsters. When the avenues of Europe narrowed, when the walls of justice pressed in even upon those who had found refuge in South America, there were others among us who turned their gaze further toward lands where old crimes meant little, and new masters sought the skills we still carried. And so I watched as some of my comrades vanished into the shifting sands of the Middle East, carried by winds of war ideology and cold calculation, into distant capitals where our pasts were viewed not as sins, but as assets. Among them was Alois Brunner, a man whose name still brought a chill to my spine. Once Eichmann's most trusted aide, Brunner had overseen the deportation of tens of thousands Jews sent to their deaths under his meticulous command. But now, in the strange aftermath of the war, I heard whispers that Brunner had remade himself in Damascus, living beneath the false name Dr. Georg Fischer. The Syrians, it was said, valued his expertise, his knowledge of security, his methods of interrogation. The very skills that had built our death factories were now turned toward crushing dissent beneath an entirely new regime. He lived there for years, an open secret. Repeated attempts were made to capture him, letters, threats, even Israeli assassination attempts. Yet Brunner remained untouched, his sanctuary protected by the very political currents that once would have condemned him. He died there hidden beneath layers of silence and complicity, while men like Wiesenthal fumed at the failure to bring him to justice. Others made similar journeys. Johann von Leers, once one of our master propagandists, fled first to Argentina, but eventually found his way to Egypt. There, under the new name Omar Amin, he converted to Islam and offered his expertise to Gamal Abdel Nasser's government. The words he once wrote for Hitler's Reich were now reshaped into venomous speeches for the Arab world's growing anti-Zionist movements. In Cairo, he continued to wage ideological war, the enemy different, the hatred familiar. Franz Rademacher, too, slipped through the fingers of those who pursued him. He had once crafted policy for the foreign ministry, helping design the machinery of deportation that fed our death camps. When Germany fell, he found temporary refuge in Syria and Egypt, his venomous beliefs still intact. His reprieve ended only when he was arrested and extradited, though many of his years were spent untouched by courts that should have claimed him much sooner. In truth, it was not ideology alone that offered my comrades sanctuary in the Middle East. It was pragmatism, cold, brutal pragmatism. The young governments of Egypt and Syria, newly emerged from colonial rule, found value in the bitter expertise we carried: military science, intelligence methods, propaganda. They needed men who understood how to build efficient security apparatuses, how to train soldiers, how to manipulate public opinion. And we understood these things far too well. The hatred of Israel that gripped much of the Arab world gave many of us a perverse new purpose. In the struggle against Zionism, our shared enemies became bridges that spanned across old divisions. We were no longer viewed as architects of genocide, but as useful tools against the rising Jewish state. I watched this from afar, with a strange mixture of horror and envy. They had found not only shelter, but purpose, their sins reframed as experience. And in this strange post-war world, I saw how the lines between justice and politics blurred into fog. Every regime that sheltered them offered its own rationale. The Soviets had their war criminals. The Americans had Operation Paperclip. The Arabs had their Nazi advisors. The pursuit of advantage always seemed to eclipse the pursuit of truth. And yet, for all their successes, for all the years they evaded punishment, the knowledge of who they were and what they had done never fully faded. Men like Wiesenthal never ceased their search. The Israeli government never forgot the names on their lists. And we, those who ran, carried the knowledge that we would never be safe from history, no matter how many borders we crossed, or governments we served. The Middle East became another refuge, yes, but not a refuge from guilt. The desert, though vast, cannot swallow memory. Even as I fled, as I built walls around my past, and sought to escape the long shadow of justice, I could not close my eyes to another terrible truth, that our crimes had not only taken lives, but stolen treasures, culture, and history itself from those we persecuted. The plunder we orchestrated was vast, and though many of us vanished into foreign lands, our looted spoils remained scattered across the world, a trail of stolen beauty that would one day summon its own relentless hunters. I saw how it began, how paintings were seized from the homes of those we deported, how priceless sculptures were loaded onto trucks under the watchful eyes of SS officers, how entire collections that had taken generations to build were stolen within hours. The great families, the Rothschilds, the Bloch-Bauers, and countless others were stripped of their heritage as we carved through Europe like locusts. For many of us, this was merely another function of war, another instrument of humiliation. But I knew even then that what we were doing was not only theft, it was an erasure. We sought to wipe them from existence, both in body and in memory. Long after our regime fell, the fight to reclaim these stolen treasures began a battle that continues even to this day. I watched from afar as survivors and descendants fought to reclaim what we had stolen from their families. I saw how the world began to awaken to the scale of our plunder. 600,000 paintings stolen, entire collections dispersed, hidden away in museums, private estates, and secret caches across Europe. One case, perhaps the most famous, gripped even me with a strange, bitter awe. The portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer by Gustav Klimt, stolen from a Jewish family in Vienna, remained lost for decades. And then, against all odds, Maria Altmann, Adele's niece, succeeded where many had failed. After years of legal warfare, the painting was finally returned to her and later sold for a staggering sum that made headlines around the world. Even Hollywood would later immortalize her struggle. That one painting became a symbol not only of wealth recovered, but of dignity reclaimed, of voices silenced, now speaking once more through canvas and gold leaf. But I knew such victories were rare. Much of what we stole was lost or buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. The museums who hung these paintings on their walls often clung to their acquisitions, citing gaps in provenance, lost records, or legal technicalities. Some cooperated willingly, others resisted. By 1998, the world attempted to bring order to the chaos through the Washington Conference Principles on Nazi-confiscated art, offering guidelines for restitution. But even then, implementation was uneven. Every museum director, every private collector faced their own reckoning. Would they surrender what we had stolen, or protect what they had inherited? And then came new discoveries, reminders of how deep our looting had penetrated. The Gurlitt trove over 1,400 artworks hidden in a Munich apartment shocked the world. Picasso Matisse Dicks' masterpieces crammed into the private hoard of Cornelius Gurlitt, the son of a Nazi-era art dealer who had traded in the plundered souls of Europe. The world watched as dusty canvases long thought lost emerged once again into public light. Each frame, each signature was another testimony to our theft. But it was not only paintings we had seized. Entire estates, businesses, jewels, bank accounts, all had been swept into the maw of our Reich. And long after our armies were defeated, organizations like the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization and the Claims Conference waged new battles to recover what could be salvaged. In the years that followed, billions of dollars would be returned to survivors and heirs, though no amount could balance what had truly been lost. I sometimes wonder whether my own share of plunder, smaller perhaps than others, still lingers in some forgotten vault, or hangs quietly in some distant home stripped of its history, but not its blood. What haunted me most, however, was not the financial cost, but the human weight behind each stolen object. Every returned painting was not simply a possession reclaimed. It was the echo of a family murdered, a voice raised from the grave, a memory that refused to be erased. When I read of one family member receiving a long-lost painting once seized from her ancestor, whispering, "This is a symbol of our family's resilience in the face of immense adversity," I could not escape the truth of it. Their resilience was undeniable, and our guilt, though buried, remained unspent. For all that we took the lives, the dignity, the history their descendants still rose from beneath our destruction. And no matter how far I fled, I carried that truth like a weight pressing forever against my spine. I once believed, or perhaps I desperately hoped, that when the Reich collapsed, when our banners burned, and our leaders fell to suicide or execution, the poisonous seed we had planted would finally wither beneath the weight of the world's judgment. But as the years passed, and I watched history unfold from the shadows, I realized with a growing sense of dread that our legacy had not been buried. It had simply changed its shape, spreading like smoke into new hearts, new lands, and new generations who never marched beneath Hitler's flag, but still whispered his hateful creed. Even from my distant refuge, I could see them rising, not as uniformed legions, as we had once been, but as fragmented cells, secret gatherings, and scattered voices echoing the very same doctrines we had once screamed to cheering crowds. They called themselves neo-Nazis, though many wore no swastikas openly. Still, their hearts beat with the same venomous rhythm we had once called purity. In America, I heard of George Lincoln Rockwell, who dared to resurrect our twisted vision in broad daylight, founding the American Nazi Party in 1959. I studied his photographs, his SS-like uniform, his banners resurrecting our old symbols, and I knew at once that our evil had not died, but merely crossed the ocean draped now in the flag of another nation. His words were brazen, unashamed. "We must have a pure white America or perish." He paraded his hatred openly until his assassination ended his campaign, though not the movement he had rekindled. In Britain, similar fires ignited. The National Front, rising in 1967, attracted disillusioned nationalists who wrapped themselves in rhetoric we once chanted. And in Germany itself, in the very soil where our crimes were committed, the National Democratic Party emerged, barely veiling its admiration for the Reich. Its rallies stirred bitter memories. Its propaganda reeked of familiar rot. Even as decades passed and our crimes were dissected in classrooms and courts, these factions continued to mutate. When the Soviet Union fell, I watched Eastern Europe descend into chaos, and in that vacuum, new waves of hatred surged. Russia's own neo-Nazis donned uniforms reminiscent of the Hitler Youth, their leaders like Alexander Barkashov parading symbols that mocked the graves of our victims. The ruins of communism offered them fertile soil, and then came the internet, that vast and borderless expanse, offering these disciples of hatred a tool I could scarcely have imagined in my own days of power. Across message boards and secret forums, they connected globally, spreading propaganda, recruiting lost souls, and resurrecting myths we once wrote in blood and ink. They forged alliances across oceans, emboldened by anonymity, their words no longer bound by borders or fear of exposure. The numbers horrified me. Hundreds of groups, tens of thousands of followers. The ideology we had once unleashed under Hitler's command now metastasized into a global cancer. And even as governments sought to monitor them, to ban their gatherings and block their broadcasts, the virus persisted, flexible, elusive, always mutating. Some governments fought back with education, Germany foremost among them, forcing its children to confront our horrors in school, hoping that knowledge might inoculate them against the temptation of our poison. Others relied on legal bans, censorship, and law enforcement, yet still the embers glowed beneath the surface. What chilled me most was not the banners or the chants, but the faces. Young men born long after our downfall, standing proudly beneath symbols of hatred they did not truly comprehend. They had not witnessed the camps. They had not shoveled the ashes or heard the screams. Yet they still embraced our darkness, as though it were some heroic, noble tradition. I realized then that evil does not require memory. It requires only grievance, only a spark of resentment that can be shaped into rage, guided by those willing to weaponize ignorance. And in that ignorance I saw the true horror of our legacy, that we had not merely corrupted our own time, but had planted seeds that would haunt generations. For all our defeats, for all the trials, for all the verdicts handed down at Nuremberg, our ideology proved more resilient than any flag or anthem. It found ways to survive even without us breathing within the cracks of fractured societies, waiting for moments of weakness to slither forth again. And so I remain even now a witness to this unending echo, the living proof that evil once unchained does not easily return to its cage, it simply waits. Even now, as I sit with the weight of years pressing upon my shoulders, I still ask myself how it happened, how I, and so many like me, surrendered our souls so easily. We were not born as monsters. We were teachers, shopkeepers, clerks, engineers, ordinary men. And yet, under the banners we once raised so high, we became willing participants in a horror that now echoes endlessly through history. After the war, as the world stared into the abyss we had created, they sought to understand how men like me could commit such crimes. The Nuremberg trials made us confess our orders, our calculations, our obedience, but they did not fully explain why we followed them so readily. That question tormented the victors far longer than any verdict. In the early years after our fall, I read of men like Theodor Adorno, who dissected us like strange specimens in a laboratory. He called it the authoritarian personality, a study claiming that those of us who craved order, who submitted easily to authority, who despised those we labeled outsiders, were uniquely vulnerable to the fascist call. It was not only our politics that damned us, he argued, but our very character. Rigid, fearful, desperate for structure, and quick to turn hostility outward. The fascist agitator is usually a master of the spoken word, Adorno said. And I remembered the speeches, the grand rallies, the hypnotic cadence of Hitler's voice, the way he drew us into his vision like moths to a flame. We felt chosen. We felt righteous. We felt necessary. Then came the experiments of Stanley Milgram in the 1960s, horrifying in their simplicity. Ordinary men given the illusion of authority willingly inflicted pain upon strangers. They pressed the buttons, heard the screams, and obeyed the voice urging them forward. Milgram's cold conclusion echoed my own memory that we do not need hatred to commit evil, only obedience. Ordinary people simply doing their jobs, he wrote, can become agents in a terribly destructive process. I recognized myself in those experiments. I too had obeyed. I too had told myself I was only doing my duty. Hannah Arendt. That piercing mind who observed Eichmann's trial, spoke of the banality of evil. She saw in us not grand villains, but men of routine, of small compromises and mechanical obedience. We did not wake each day hungering for murder. We simply performed the tasks assigned to us, numbed to their consequences by the machinery that surrounded us. The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil, Arendt wrote. And I could not deny it. I had not consciously chosen evil. I had simply never questioned my orders. Yet others argued that such simplicity was a comfort and escape. Christopher Browning's study of ordinary men examined the battalions who shot Jews in Poland face to face without gas chambers or distance. Many of them, like me, had no prior history of violence. Yet they obeyed. They killed not out of hatred, but out of conformity of loyalty to their comrades, of fear of standing apart. And now even science probes deeper. I have read of brain scans and neural pathways of studies seeking to map how extremist beliefs form within the mind itself, whether biology, trauma, or identity drives men toward ideologies like ours. But no matter how complex the theories become, the same bitter core remains. We surrendered our conscience to the group, to the leader, to the cause. Groupthink, social identity, the intoxicating lure of belonging. We found purpose in being Aryans and seeing ourselves as superior in demonizing those who were different. We cheered the chance because we wanted to belong. And once we belonged, we stopped asking questions. That is the truth that haunts me most, how easy it was, how little was required to turn me from man to monster. And as the world continues to study us, dissect us, teach our crimes to children in their classrooms, I pray, though I scarcely deserve the privilege, that they will not forget these lessons, that they will remain vigilant, for evil does not wear horns or scales. It wears faces like mine, familiar, eager, willing to obey. What we unleashed was not unique to us. It lies dormant in every society, every generation waiting. Now, as the weight of my years drags me toward the inevitable silence, I am left alone with my memories that claw at my mind with relentless fingers. I have watched the Reich rise in glory and fall in ruin. I have watched justice chase my comrades across continents and decades. I have seen new regimes, new wars, and new generations wrestle with the monstrous legacy we left behind. And yet, for all the trials, the executions, the confessions, and the endless documents unearthed, I know that the story of what we did, of what I did, can never truly be closed. It is a wound that will bleed across centuries because our crimes were not merely against the men and women we murdered, but against humanity itself. We poisoned the air that others still breathe. I have watched Germany rebuild itself from the ashes, purging its schools, its laws, its symbols of the twisted ideology we once worshipped. I have seen the world drag stolen art from forgotten vaults, returning fragments of beauty to families we tried to erase. I have seen the children of my comrades struggle beneath the weight of names they never chose, some denying, others defying, all haunted. I have watched the world too, as it stumbled into the same mistakes again and again. New tyrants rise, new lies spread, new hatreds fester. The same excuses are whispered in new tongues, always obedience, always loyalty, always fear disguised as duty. The machinery of evil requires no genius. It requires only our silence. I was silent. When the orders came, I obeyed. When the crimes unfolded, I looked away. And when the Reich fell, I fled. I am not the victim here. I was one of the hands that built the machine. And yet, there were those who refused to let us vanish into the fog of history. Men like Simon Wiesenthal carried our names like curses, hunting us one by one across oceans and years. He did not forget. He forced the world to remember. There were those who gathered in courtrooms, who faced our testimonies with hollow eyes. There were those who uncovered our stolen paintings, who reclaimed their ancestors' homes, who stood in Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor and whispered to the ghosts we left behind, "We remember you." And there were those children, grandchildren, who studied our crimes not out of hatred, but out of desperate determination never to let them happen again. I see them now, those young faces standing in schools, reading the names of the murdered, tracing the rise of the Reich in textbooks we once burned. They are the true judges of my life, not the tribunals, not the governments, but the generations who carry the burden of memory. Elie Wiesel, a man we failed to destroy, once said, "For the dead and the living we must bear witness." And now, though I can offer no absolution, no defense, no redemption, I whisper my final confession into the void. Remember what we did. Remember what I became. And never let the world forget how easy it was for men like me to descend into darkness. That perhaps is the only small service I can render here at the end, not to defend myself, but to stand exposed before history, stripped of excuses, a silent warning written in flesh and bone.